Well, this passage comes from the very beginning of the famous chapter 25, in which Machiavelli talks about, it's headed, how much fortune can influence human affairs and how much she should be resisted. It's mostly famous because at the end of it, Machiavelli talks that fortune is a woman and man should beat her and so on, which of course is what feminists take offence against. But that's not the passage I'm going to be reading to you. I'm reading from the first one, and this is how it begins. I am not unaware that many people have thought, and still think, that the affairs of the world are so governed by fortune, fortuna, and by God, Dio, that men are incapable of controlling them with their prudence. Indeed, they have no remedy at all. For this reason, they think it's useless to sweat unduly over affairs, and instead they would leave them to be governed by chance. This opinion has been made more popular recently because of the great changes that have been seen and are seen every day, changes that are quite unimaginable. Sometimes, when thinking about it, I'm inclined partly to agree with them. Nevertheless, in order that our free will, libero arbitrio, isn't extinguished, I think it's possible that fortune is arbiter of half of our actions, but that even she leaves the other half, or almost, for us to govern. And then he continues with his famous image of fortune being like a raging river that when it's at its height, there's nothing you can do about it, but when it's running low, then you can raise barriers and so on. So it's not impossible to do nothing about it at all. Well, in the passage I've read to you, it's the beginning and the end that I find most revealing. First two words which I read in Italian, God and fortune, rule the world. Most people think that God and fortune are the forces that rule the world. And that, he says, is the traditional view. This is what most people think. But Machiavelli's view, with which he ends the paragraph, is that fortune and human free choice rule the world. Well, you notice what's happened. I mean, God has slipped out altogether. First of all, it was God and fortune ruling the world, but Machiavelli says, but I think, nevertheless, I think that fortune and men rule the world, or more or less divide the world. Well, what do we make of this? First of all, we should perhaps say something about God ruling the world. This, of course, is the traditional idea of providence. If you're a Christian, you believe that the world is in the hands of God's providence. He's got you in his care, and basically he knows what's going to happen. If not influencing it, he certainly knows what's happening. And if we don't know that, something seems to be quite fortuitous. It's only really that we don't know the reasons for it. There is a reason, but we don't know it. And I think we can see how prevalent this view is. Well, I mean, it's still one's view, really, as a Christian, but I was thinking of the chronicles that we read and histories, and they nearly always say at some point, but there's nothing we can do about it. God's will be done. Letters are written about events and so on. And again, it's always God's will be done. There's nothing we can do about it. So here Machiavelli is talking about this as a view, and he says he partly shares it. But he's clearly not prepared to do that. But before that, he talks about fortune and these events he refers to, the great changes that have been seen and are seen every day. Well, here he was referring to the French invasions of Italy, 1494, when the regimes of Florence, the Medici regime, was overturned, replaced by a republic. and in Naples the government was overturned. The King of France was claiming the kingdom of Naples, and the king had to leave. And then in 1499 there was a second French invasion when the Forza dukes were forced out of Milan. So big events, big changes of regimes. And if you consider that in the previous year there'd always been a few foreign invasions, but nothing like this, the French were extremely cruel, and the Italians were horrified, having fought with condottieri, little small battles. So this is a moment when, in fact, many of the Italians start talking about fortune, because they say it was quite unprecedented what happened, and it enters the historical vocabulary, if you like. But I should also say that the word for a tempest in Italian is fortuna. So the Florentines were already well aware of this use of the word, and as merchants who often had cargoes on ships and so on, they were aware from that point of view too of the sudden storms that arose, and they often lost the whole of their cargoes. So fortune is a very real force for Italians at the time, but as I say, the responsibility for what happened was always shared. Mainly it was God's responsibility, but fortune was there too. And Machiavelli says, I partly agree with this view. Nevertheless, and he always uses that when he's going to make his own original point, he says that in order that our free will, our libero arbitrio, isn't extinguished, I think it's possible that fortune is responsible for half our actions and ourselves the other half. Well, here again we must go back to Lucretius, because the new thing that happened, which really made fortune far more important really at the time, was the recovery of Lucretian atomism. Because although the classical philosophers, as well as Christian ones, did believe in providence, the importance of events being predicted, foreseen, even Aristotle believed that the world is ruled by design, that nature is much more natural philosophy, but he thought that nature had a design, nothing happened. Nature does nothing in vain, he said, and there was a telos or an end. So that gave a sort of a non-fortuitous plan. Things did work according to events. By contrast, the Epicurean philosophy was totally different. It had no idea of providence, and it had no idea of design. Instead, the world was created by the chance clash of atoms in space out of matter. It's a very materialistic philosophy. But in order for it not to be purely determined, the Epicureans talked about a swerve which made the atoms move slightly, and this allowed free will, so that in this world there was an element. It gave us free will for us to, all living creatures, that is animals as well as men, they're free to move and follow their pleasure. So when Machiavelli talks about the importance of free will, which he does, it's not Christian free will. He's not talking about God allowing Christians to choose salvation or not. It's something inbuilt in humans, thanks to the atoms that he's made of, that enables him to make up his mind and not be determined by what happens. He can break the pattern and so on. And we know that Machiavelli was very influenced by this, because when he copied, he made his transcription of Lucretius, he wrote in the margin in Book 2, where Lucretius describes this atomistic universe. He writes in the margin, from motion is variety, and from it we have free will. So we know he picked it out. It's written in his own hand, and it's a special marginal comment. So I think this is an important, something very original to Machiavelli, And he's pointing it out in this chapter that it's breaking the traditional view of thinking. We can see it in, there's a nice example how he applies it to animals, because he's writing to his son right at the end of his life, and he said, I think you should let the mad mule go free so he can enjoy himself. And you have a sort of idea here of what he means by animal freedom. But since in The Prince we're talking really about politics, I think we see how this is relevant in the following chapter, chapter 26, which he addresses to the Medici to free England. And he says in it that God does not want to do everything in order not to deprive us of free will. So here then it has the political connotation that the prince is able to take control in a moment of crisis, and what he wants the Medici prince to do in this instance is to unite Italy, defend them against the barbarians, and this he thinks that a strong man has the power to do. So if we pull these two chapters together, I think we have a very a view that fortune in fact isn't dominant, that in certain circumstances free will and the important role of humans can change the fortune as it's developed.